All right, good evening, everybody. We have a packed house. Thanks for joining us tonight for the last lecture of 2018. Can't believe the holidays are already here. So my name is Kim Thompson. I'm the program manager of the Aquarium Seafood for the Future program. For those of you who don't know, Seafood for the Future is a conservation program here at the Aquarium that works on facilitating and promoting the responsible growth of marine aquaculture or farming in the sea, primarily in the United States, to support food farming and conservation. So tonight we're very fortunate to have one of the experts who we rely on heavily. He's been a fantastic resource for us as well as the marine aquaculture world in general. Scott Nichols had a biochemistry background. He went to UCLA, in LA, right in our backyard. He was founder of Verlasso Salmon, which is a salmon farming company out of Chile. And he's been on a number of boards, including for the Aquaculture Stewardship Council, which is a seafood certification program, Seafood Nutrition Partnership, and again, he's been an invaluable resource for Seafood for the Future in the Aquarium. And he's currently working as an independent consultant with his own firm, Foods Future. So I want to welcome Scott Nichols.
Thank you all for coming today, and thanks, Kim, for the invitation to talk to you. I think that of the two most important things that humans will do over the next 30 years, one of them is to expand aquaculture dramatically. I'm going to tell you why I think that in a while. But what I'd like to do first is to go through a couple of stories to explain why it is I've come to that conclusion and how I arrived there. When I was 5 years old, my family moved to Hawaii. I told you I was going to divert a bit. And this was the house that we lived in right here. Except it was, no, this is the one right here. It wasn't this big. These two things here weren't here. And outside, we had 2 papaya trees, 2 banana trees, and an avocado tree that they've lost. And whatever space that they gained by doing that, they lost those trees, and so it was their net loss. This stream here that you see ran from an on-land lake down into the ocean. It was about a 2.5-mile stream, and it was filled with tilapia. And my dad taught me how to fish, and I loved to go out in the backyard and fish. And it was not much of a trip, 5 meters, 7 maybe. And I was able to be fishing. And when I got to first grade, a year later, one of the things that was true in Hawaii at the time, I don't know actually this many years later if it still is, was that everything started very early in the day, and my school bus picked me up before 6:30 in the morning. Now, I'd been in the habit of fishing every day since we moved there, and I found after a little while that I wasn't being able to fish after school in the afternoon, so I started going out in the mornings. And I would come in at 5:45 with a fish. And my mom, who was not, my dad was a native Hawaiian, my mom wasn't, she's a Californian from San Jose. And she was okay with this business of getting the day started really early at 5:45 in the morning. But the fish, well, that was another thing altogether. And I only learned many years later that she said to my dad, "We have a problem. What are you going to do about it? And by the way, I got my pronouns exactly right." So what my dad did was he taught me how to cook the fish that I walked in with every morning when I was in first grade. And it was pretty simple. You plop it in the pan, you wait a bit, you turn it over, you wait a bit, and you put it on a plate and you eat it. Now, if you're in Hawaii, what you do, oops, daisy, that was not what I meant to do. What you do is you eat it with poi. Now, if anybody here was a native or raised from an early age in Hawaii, poi is the delectable daily thing one must eat because of all of its fabulousness. What poi is it's a puree of taro roots. Now, if the first time you ever went to Hawaii, you were an adult, your reaction to poi was a little bit different. It was probably something like this. I didn't eat library paste when I was a kid, and I have no idea why should I start doing it now. But anyway, this was my breakfast, fish and poi. And I was so tantalized by being able to go into the kitchen and cook and make something for myself. I didn't realize it at the time, I didn't realize it till quite a bit later, but it was a life transformative event for me. And it was tantalizing and interesting, and I love to do it to this day. Another thing that I have found tantalizing and completely interesting is biology. And what I'd like to do is to talk a little bit about biology and why I find it so interesting. And that takes me forward from the time I was in first grade and went until I was in graduate school. Now, biochemistry and biology, like I said, are particularly interesting. And I probably don't have to say that because I know you all are probably really interested in those as well. I got that right? And one of the things that is so interesting about biology is how smart biology is. It's just almost mind-bogglingly smart. And let me give you an example of that. So, here's some fish tacos. When you eat a fish taco, you turn some of that into energy. And you turn some of it into your left bicep. And you turn some of it into your brain. Your body? Your body's got this wired. It just does it. Through a series of incredibly intricate molecular mechanisms with all sorts of controls and things operating to make it work. It works, and it works every time. You don't eat a fish taco and have it turn all into left bicep so you look like some weird version of Luke Cage. It all works and is intricately organized. And one of the things that happened at the time that I was in graduate school was that there were some changes in technology that gave rise, to the ability to do things and understand nutrition and metabolism in ways that we hadn't been able to do that before. And I'm going to talk about those in a second. But first of all, what I want to do is show you a fish farm. If I can show my mastery of the obvious here, this isn't a fish farm. But this is a volcano that is on a way to a fish farm that I went to. This is in southern Chile. And this volcano was about to erupt in a couple of weeks. And so the pilot thought it would be a really cool idea if we would just fly around this. Well, when a volcano's about to erupt in 2 weeks, there's all kinds of isotherms and hot air blowing places. And this was like one of the worst rides I had ever had in my life. But the benefit was that we landed and got on a boat and went for 3 hours in a boat to this farm in southern Chile. This is a salmon farm. And the lines that you see running from the farm into the foreground are the lines that the feed goes from a tender barge out to the farm. And I'm going to show you a picture of salmon being fed through those tubes in a little while, but I just wanted to tell you that right now. On our way to this farm, it's kind of interesting. We saw a flock of about 100 penguins as we were coming in. Like I said, this is way south. And about a half hour after that, we saw a pod of orcas. And so I'm guessing that the flock of penguins that we saw was much less than 100 a little bit after that. Okay, back to metabolism. This chart is a chart of all of the metabolic pathways and their controls in a human cell. I tried to convince myself, I did convince myself, but that when I would stand in front of this thing for an hour and read it, it's 3 feet tall and 5 feet wide, that I was actually learning really important things. My wife's view of that was that I really needed a hobby. So as intricate and controlled as this is, it can reduce to something that schematically is a bit more understandable, and that's here. So on the left, we have two cells. They each take in something called A. Say it comes from a fish taco. And the cell on the left chooses to turn it into B, and the cell on the right chooses to turn it into C, because the genetic propensity in those cells has made a decision for how it's going to deal with A. But I mentioned a minute ago that there was a tool that gave us the ability to understand so much more about metabolism than we'd been able ever to understand before, and that's depicted in the cell that's on your far right, the new one. So what we could do was we could take the genetic elements out of these two cells, 1 and 2, put them together into something that made an altogether new and different pathway. And that allowed two things. One, it allows you to make things that heretofore have been very difficult to make or very rare. And secondly, it allows you to make things that are altogether new. And I'll give you a couple of examples of each of them. Up until 1982, insulin was produced by the pancreas of cows and pigs from slaughterhouses. And it worked. But for some people, that foreign protein would give rise to an allergic reaction, and they would reject it. And these people would invariably die from their diabetes. In 1982, the pathway to make insulin from human cells was put into a bacterium. And now insulin is grown in those bacteria, and they are what now provide us, and since 1982 have provided us with insulin in the United States. A second way that you can think about this is that a pathway to make biodegradable plastic has been placed into a bacterium. And so now you can grow bacteria that will make a fully formed plastic, and the feedstock for that is a sugar. It's not a petroleum product that goes, a petroleum derivative that gets made into something. And what this gave rise to then was the opportunity to make a biological economy. This is outside a restaurant in northern Scotland, and there's a, right over here. This is a mussel farm, though, it's hard to tell. And this double rainbow came out, and so I thought, well, I really need to try to get that. What were we talking about? Metabolism. And so what this now makes it possible for us to do is to have a change in the way that we view so many things. And the possibility exists now that we can turn ourselves from a chemically based economy perhaps into a more biologically based economy. And the biological tools that we had were well and good. But a tool doesn't tell the whole story. So, if you want to build a house, having a hammer is a very good thing. It's probably necessary, but it's not sufficient. Because until you have a carpenter, until you have somebody who knows what to do with that hammer, you're not going to have a house. So you have to use the tools. And it seemed to me that if I wanted to be a part of developing a new biologically based economy, that this was going to involve not so much inventions, which is making tools, but innovation, which is using tools. And so I reasoned if I wanted to do this business, I probably ought to figure out something about business, and so I went to business school, so I could do exactly that. This is Loch Ness in Scotland. I was on my way to a salmon farm that's at just the very northern tip of Scotland, and it was a beautiful day, and we stopped here to look at Loch Ness, and I was really hoping that I would get to see the monster, but the monster never showed itself. But you see this arrow? I did get to see a red buoy. So I went to Loch Ness. I saw something sticking out of it, and that was good. I could take that. It's just fine. So let's come back to our fish taco. You know what? I didn't do on the last one. I didn't explain what it was. Okay, so this is a slaw that I made with the chipotle mayonnaise, and the fish is mahi-mahi, and I just fried that very simply. On top of that is a tomato and jalapeno salsa, and then on top of that I added a few pickled red onions. I'm sorry, I should have mentioned that earlier. But if we come back to this now and we say, well, let's think about what this is. And it is, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that. When we look at this, we see, okay, there's the tortilla. The tortilla is largely, not entirely, but is largely carbohydrates. The fish is, again, not entirely, but it's largely protein. And then the chipotle mayonnaise, again, not entirely, but largely, it's fat. And it turns out that these are the three important elements for us as carnivores, the macro ingredients for us to have in our diets. Now, we need a whole slew and smattering of different small, teeny, tiny things, but the bulk of what we eat is this. The salmon are different than us in that they're carnivores. So they eat things like, well, they eat other fish. They eat snails, they eat eels, they eat shrimp, they eat insects. But they don't eat carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are actually harmful if in their diets. So they eat proteins and fats. Okay, I was remiss on the last one. This is a court bouillon I made, and then I finished it when I got done with dill creme fraiche. It was really good. I'm really lucky that I work at home, so I'm 15 meters from a kitchen, and so I consider it my imperative to go into the kitchen and cook every day. I used to work somewhere else, and I drove 40 minutes each way to work, so that was an hour and 20 minutes a day that I felt I lost. Yeah, there's all things considered, but that didn't quite make it up. And so I figured if I go in the kitchen every day and I spend an hour cooking lunch, I've saved 20 minutes on the day. So that's the story that I tell myself, and I'm really happy with it. Okay, back to salmon. So salmon are like us, but they're not. And what they do, what they get out of their diets, again, is these proteins and the fats. But one of the things they get out of the fats is they get omega-3 fatty acids. And for a salmon, an omega-3 fatty acid is a gotta have. It's not a nice to have. They absolutely must have them to be able to survive. And the way that omega-3 fatty acids largely are made on the planet is through, they're first made by photosynthetic algae in the plankton. And then small microscopic animals will eat those phytoplankton, and then it'll move up the food chain, and they end up in high concentrations in fish like anchoveta and sardines. And I didn't have a picture of any anchoveta. These sardines are not from out here in the aquarium. I took these at another aquarium just up to the north here, but it was a small inconsequential place, and I've forgotten its name. But when we come back now and think about nutrition and metabolism again, when we take something in, like the fish taco that we ate earlier, some of that's used for energy, like I said. Some of it is used to make new stuff. So proteins, for instance, are repurposed when you take them into your body. So picture, if you will, a protein is like beads on a string. This is a rough analogy, okay? And when you digest them, you digest the string and you end up with just the beads, which are amino acids. You then repurpose those amino acids to make them into your proteins. So this is what you do to make your left bicep. And then there is a third group of things where we don't really make them ourselves, or we can make a smidge, but we don't make enough of anything to be able to do anything with it. And that would be the case with omega-3 fatty acids. We don't break them down and reform them. They're used as they come in, and then they're repositioned somewhere else. So your brain is roughly, by weight, 1/3 or so of one of the omega-3 fatty acids called DHA. DHA comes into your diet and it goes straight to your brain. It's not broken down like the protein, which is broken down into beads off beads on a string. And this is the exact same thing with salmon. They don't make enough of the, they don't make enough of the omega-3 for them to meet all of their needs. So they eat these guys, and then they find what they need. This is a piece of fish that was done in a frying pan. This sauce is just delectable. It is macadamia nut and coconut milk sauce that has a bit of, quite a number of spices in it, and this bok choy was just simply fried. Oh, didn't mean to do that. So when we think about salmon aquaculture in particular, but other aquaculture as well with carnivorous animals, what we need to think about is that these animals need to find sources of omega-3s, and whether it's in the wild or whether they're on a farm, we need to find those sources of omega-3s for them. This picture was on a trip that I was making, again, to a farm in southern Chile. So I wanted to put the slide of the fish tacos up for a third time, because that's really what I want to talk about, but you already seen the slide of the fish tacos, and so I decided to put this one up instead. These are scallops, and this is a corn coulis, and it's garnished with a little bit of tomato and chopped basil. When we think about aquaculture, and when we think about raising fish, then this is intimately tied to the diets that we can provide for them. And one of the things about the fisheries that produce the small little oily fish that end up being rendered and turned into fish meal and fish oil, is those fisheries are harvested at their sustainable limits right now. And by that I mean we can probably continue to take what we already take from them, but we can't take anything more. That means our supply of fish oil is capped, and that means the omega-3 fatty acids that we have available to ourselves for aquaculture or for whatever is in your daily multivitamin is capped. We don't get any more of that, and our population is increasing. So what that means is that per person we'll have less. And when we think about what we can get from aquaculture, because now aquaculture diets, at least for carnivorous fish, will be so intimately tied to the availability of things from the sea, what we need to consider is how are we going to deal with that in the future? If we have all of the farmed fish that we need right now, I think people agree, most experts agree, not all certainly, that the fisheries that provide us fish oil and fish meal are well managed. So we can continue to take from them what we do now. And if we have all of the farmed fish that we need and that we want, well, there's no issue. The only time this comes into play as a question is if we decide that we don't have all that we need and that we want more. And so this brings us to a fundamental question, and that fundamental question is this: what role do farmed fish play in our future food supply? And to begin to answer that, what we need to do is to ask the question, well, where does our food come with this dark light? This is the first time that the slides have been shining white light in my eyes, and I'm able to see you all. It's so nice to see you. Thank you for coming. We need to ask the question, where does our food come from now? What does that look like? And where's our food going to come from in the future? And when we think about what kind of demands are going to be placed on our future food supply, we come fast on to the notion that probably by about 2038, our population will be 9 billion, and by 2050, our population will be 9.8 billion, and it's probably 7.3 billion-ish right now. Not only will we have more people, but the pattern of wealth is changing in the world as well. Every year, the CIA does an economic analysis of the 193 nations that make up the United Nations. And what they found in 2016 was that 47 countries in the world have real GDP growth rates of greater than 5%. And this includes countries like South Sudan and other small economies where any incremental change by percentage is a tremendous change, but it also includes India and China and Bangladesh. So wealth is growing rapidly in the world. Right now, in the world, we have, by however demographers denote, we have about 1.9 billion people in the middle class right now in the world. And in 20 years, that number is going to be 3.9 billion people. And with the change in wealth and a change in economic status comes a change in what people want to see on the dinner table. And so not only do we need more food, compositionally it needs to change as well. And the big change in demand comes with animal proteins. So the WWF has predicted that we roughly need to double our food supply by the beginning of the 2040s. And the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations has said that we need to increase it by 1.7-fold. There are legitimate ways that these two estimates disagree, but I'd say that those, for the sake of here, what we're talking about today, it doesn't matter. The difference between 1.7 and 2 is both are gargantuanly huge, and so focus on that. Our current agriculture uses up 38% of the world's land and 70% of the world's fresh water. Well, quite clearly, we're not going to double the 70%, and practically, we're not going to double 38% either. It's not the worst, it's not the worst 38% that's in production right now. It's the best 38%. So what we have is a situation that seems rather untenable. Since aquaculture began about 11,000 years ago, it has been able to meet all of our increased demands in any time that they've been thrown at it. Things like mechanization and hybridization, putting animals in pens, and a variety of other things have always meant that we were able to keep up with the demand for future food needs. Right now, we don't see any clear path from where we are that has a trajectory to a hopeful or plentiful food future. In fact, really, the one thing we know about our path to a hopeful food future is this: it's not the one we're currently on. So what do we do about that? And this comes back to the question that I was asking a moment ago about what we do with aquaculture. Because 2 billion people are coming to dinner. We got no bloody idea at all what we're going to feed them. And this is why I said at the beginning of our talk that I think one of the two most important things that can possibly happen in our future is that we learn how to do aquaculture better. So it's clear that the land is not going to be able to provide everything we need, but we can look to the sea, and we can look also to wild fish as well as farmed fish. So the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations every other year does a survey called the World Fisheries and Aquaculture. And what they do in that report is they measure the status of wild fisheries. And in 2008, they found that 80% of the world's fisheries were harvested at or above their sustainable limits. Well, it's very clear what happens when something's harvested at its sustainable limit. You can't take any more of it, you got to take less. But when something is at its sustainable limit, not above it, you can't take any more. And probably, if you keep on always pushing things at their limit, you'll eventually break them. And so we should probably pull back a little bit from fisheries that are harvested at the utmost of their sustainable limit. In subsequent years from 2008, we haven't seen the picture emerge to get much prettier, to the point where in the report this year in April, they found 93% of the world's fisheries were harvested at or above their sustainable limits. So when we think about getting more food from the ocean, if we want to increase our consumption of fish, clearly we're not going to be able to do it with wild-caught fish. Switch gears a little bit from just the population dynamics and quantity to some qualitative aspects about fish. In 2006, two researchers at the School of Public Health at Harvard University did a study, and it was actually a study of studies, a meta-study. So what they did was they looked at the results from, it was from 12 different studies to say, what does it mean when you eat fish? What happens? And what they found was that if we were to eat in the United States 2 helpings of fish a week, we would find that heart disease would decrease by 36% and overall death rates would decrease by 17%. This is a stunning number. This is a bigger deal than smoking and seatbelts put together. And then 2 months ago in September, another study came out, and this was is a single individual study of 420,000 people who were followed for 16 years. And they compared fish consumption in the top and the bottom group. And what they found was deaths due to Alzheimer's disease decreased by 38% in men and 25% in women, and lung disease deaths decreased by 20%. So there's some really compelling reasons. There's some compelling reasons for us to eat seafood. Here's one more. This is a piece of barramundi, and I always keep orange confit in the fridge. Whenever I peel an orange, I throw it into a jar, and then when I get the jar filled up, I make orange confit out of it so that I can do this. And then this is a beet that I'd cooked, and so I just wrap it up in parchment, chuck it into the toaster oven, 23 minutes later, it's ready. So there's some compelling reasons to eat fish for this reason. This was delicious, guys. So we come back to the question that I posed a couple of minutes ago. What should aquaculture's role be, and what should the role of farm fish be in our food future? And I've done everything I can in the past 5 minutes to try to convince you that I think it is just utterly important that we do this. And if we're going to do it, then we really do need to pay very close attention to what it is we feed fish. Because one of the things I mentioned when I was talking about the past performance of agriculture was how the Green Revolution did so much to provide for increased food supplies. And I think there are estimates that have been made by many that say the Green Revolution saved 1 billion lives. And Norman Borlaug, who was really the sort of the progenitor and father of all of this, received a Nobel Peace Prize for the work that he did figuring out how to increase agricultural yields. But one of the things that happened with that was, if you kind of flip it over and look at the other side of the Green Revolution, it came with a fair amount of environmental degradation. And a blue revolution can't be accompanied by environmental degradation in the same way that the Green Revolution was. What we have to do is we have to learn how to make more food on less space with fewer inputs and lower impacts. So that then becomes a yardstick by which we measure aquaculture and say, are we farming fish in a way that is appropriate, that matters? Are we doing what we need to do for our future? And are we taking the entirety of the big picture into our consideration when we do that? So the things that I mentioned a moment ago were inputs and others. So when you consider inputs, there's a couple of ways that you can look at it. And I'll tell you both of the ways that I think you can. One is to look at the amount of feed that goes into feeding the animals that we eat. And the second thing is counting the calories that go into the animals that we eat, and then the calories that we actually eat from those animals. So it's sort of like calories in, calories out. It takes 22.5 kilos of feed to raise a cow so that you can put 1 kilo of cow onto the table. For pork, that's somewhere around 10. For chickens, it's somewhere around 4. And for salmon, it's right around 2. So the amount, the bulk of feed that's needed to raise some of these other animals is quite considerably more than it is for salmon. But one can, I think, reasonably point out that the caloric density, the amount of calories that the salmon eat in that amount of food is the thing that's important. So when you think of how many calories does it take to raise something and how many do we get back? We get 19.5% of the invested calories back when we eat a salmon. From a chicken, it's 16% if you eat all the skin. It's 11% if you just eat the meat. With pork, it's 5%. And with beef, the number is so all over the place that when I started to do the calculations, I started looking out my window and I would say, oh, look, there's Bug. Oh, look how shiny that blade of grass is. And I realized that I was not going to take the time and effort that it took to go ahead and do what needed to be done for beef. So I'll leave you just with those. But quite clearly, however you wish to measure it, salmon, for instance, is superior to other forms of animal agriculture. And this is not just parochial to salmon. Other carnivorous finfish do this too. And one of the reasons that this happens is, picture, if you will, what are the needs that a salmon has to fulfill and what are the needs that a cow has to fulfill? Well, a salmon doesn't have to control, or any fish, doesn't have to control its body temperature. So it doesn't spend any of its calories on maintaining its internal core temperature. They live in a weightless environment, so they don't need to build a bone structure that helps them fight gravity. They, in fact, experience no gravity. And then that means that a lot less of what goes into a fish gets spent on bones, and a lot less of what goes into a fish gets spent on temperature maintenance. So it makes teleological sense that that would be true. Space. Oh, this is in a fjord in Scotland, and this is a salmon farm that I visited. So one of the things that we need to do in considering agriculture in general is, what do we do to intensify our agriculture? Clearly that's what we need to do. We can't continue to take up the same amount of resource to produce the food that we're producing. We have to get more from less. So if you consider then and this is, I'm talking about on the basis of calories here again. When you consider the output per acre of a farm, for beef cattle, you get about 1.1 million calories per acre of food for us. With chickens, it's about 3.6, and with pork, it's about 1.5. This isn't an altogether fair comparison because a salmon farm is three-dimensional. Most salmon farms and other fish farms are 15-ish meters deep, and so you have that benefit of farming in 3 dimensions rather than in just 2. But compared to the 1 and 3 for the terrestrial animals, a salmon farm produces 750 million calories per surface area of an acre. There was a paper written recently by a woman named Hallie Freilich from University of California, Santa Barbara. It's not UCLA, but it's okay. And what she did was to look at the sites that would be suitable for high-intensity ocean agriculture throughout the world. She was very strict in how she would disallow certain things to be included. So it couldn't be in a marine protected area. It couldn't be near a shipping lane. And it couldn't have, for instance, a water depth of greater than 200 meters. And there's a variety of different strictures that she placed on this and came up with a number that said 3% of the ocean's surface is suitable for ocean aquaculture. Okay, fine. How do you put that in perspective? The way that she did that was to say that 0.015% of the ocean's surface would suffice to, if farmed, would meet the production of all of our wild capture fisheries right now, which is to say, on average, what the FAO finds is it's about 90 million tons a year. So if you were to farm on 0.9%, not all the 3% that she said was possible, if you were to farm on 0.9% of the ocean's surface, you would be able to make 60 kilograms of fish per person per year when our population hits 9 billion in roughly 2038 or so. This is a stunning amount of food. And it's a game changer. And it's why some of the sort of Eeyore-ish presentation that I've given you over the past few minutes, I think, can be washed aside and found to be much more hopeful. So, space, aquaculture's got it. Impacts. Oh, okay. So this is a salmon farm in Cliquot Sound in British Columbia. And I don't like to do this, but I couldn't memorize this. Hell, I have trouble with my middle name. So I thought I'd just read it to you. And this is from Conservation International. They say it's apparent from this study, it's a study they did a few years ago, that aquaculture from an ecological and environmental impact perspective has clear benefits over other forms of animal source food production for human consumption. In view of this, where resources are stretched, the relative benefits of policies that promote fish farming over other forms of livestock production should be considered. So, in an independent way, an environmental NGO, in looking at all kinds of livestock, found that the least impactful of all livestock production happens with fish farming. And they further said, I won't read all of this to you because it says what I said earlier. We can get this right if we get the feed part right, but we've got to get the feed part right. And if we don't, then we will be faced with looking at something like what the Green Revolution offered us. So again, it's protein, fats, and carbohydrates. Hold that thought. This was my go at protein, fats, and carbohydrates. So this is a pasta with squid ink. And you know, sometimes when you get pastas and they've got flavors in them, they just you don't really get it. I've never really tasted the sun-dried tomato and sun-dried tomato pasta. But I put so much squid ink into this pasta when I make my pasta because it's really easy. And so there's so much squid ink in there that the house kind of smells bad for a couple hours after I make it. But what I do is I leave it in the fridge and we don't eat it till the next day. So the smell's kind of out of your mind. And then these are shrimp and clams. And then I cook the onions in God's quantity of butter, and so I have protein, fats, and carbohydrates all wrapped up into this. So let's examine each one of these in turn and see how exactly do we find the status of the ingredients that we need for aquaculture. I'll start from the bottom over here. Soy makes a lot of protein, and soy can be used to provide protein into aquaculture. And it's being done, and quite a bit is going into aquaculture throughout the world. Like anything else in agriculture, soy can be grown well and it can be grown poorly. If you're slashing a rainforest in Brazil and so you can get 3 years worth of a soy crop, because you've gotten all those nutrients that have been released by burning the forest, well, that is not a favorable way forward, and it doesn't count as something being done well. But soy in the United States is being grown in a very good way in most cases. And if the measure of sustainability is you can continue to do in the future the way that you're doing now, soy probably meets that stricture. Insects and microbes are two very interesting things that are being used to make proteins. And one of the things that's interesting about them is the way that they use the stuff that feeds them. So what happens sometimes is you'll have a process. You'll do something, you're finished with your process, you got some kind of gook and you throw it away. And that's inherently wasteful. But if you can find a way at the end of your process to be looking at this stuff and say, well, wait, this is not gook to throw away. This is the valuable feedstock for the next thing. That, in fact, is what's happening with insects and microbes, is that waste streams from other processes then become the very valuable feedstock for growing these things. And this has actually been reduced to practice, and some some diets are being made with both, many diets are being made with soy, and some are being made with insects and microbes. So last week, company, actually the largest animal feed company in the world called Nutrico, from the Netherlands, announced that they have made a salmon feed, actually, that has its proteins, as its protein source, insect proteins. So it's not whole, they don't grow them to adulthood, they grow them to a larval stage, and then they isolate the larvae, make a meal, and then that's the protein that goes in. Microbes as well are being used to make protein. There's a company called NipBio in the US, in Boston, that makes protein in a single cell microbe, and it uses as its feedstock a waste stream from another process. So what I want to show you here, this is something that I didn't make. My friend Neil Sims is a fish farmer, and he raises a fish called kampachi. And it is the most delicious fish I've ever eaten in my life. It's just superb. So I want to tell another story. My daughter was going to have her wisdom teeth taken out. And she said, and they were all, each one was sideways. You know, so they're going to get in there and do all that kind of chiseling and knocking around stuff. She said, I don't get to eat anything but milkshakes through a straw for the next 10 days. So I want you to make me a dinner the night before I have my surgery that really kills it. And so, yeah, it was she's a fairly critical sort as well, so the pressure was on. And so what I did was I got a piece of Neil's fish, and everybody in my family pronounced it the best fish they'd ever had in their lives. And what's important about this, is also the food photography. So I'd say I'm a quarter of a food photographer, but Neil's pretty much got it 100%. But one of the things that Neil has done is he's been a pioneer in using microbes and soy as ingredients. He raises a carnivorous fish, and he's found that these ingredients actually suffice. So I would say we have a very hopeful picture when we consider the proteins that we can use for aquaculture that replace the marine ingredients. They help to remove any cap on the amount of aquaculture that we have available to us. And so I'd say that's a very hopeful future. For fats, it's largely about the omega-3s. You can get a lot of oils that produce a lot of calories, but that's not the issue. That's not the seminal issue in thinking about how you build a fish diet. Oops, I didn't mean to do that either. So I don't know who comes and sits in this bench. There is this down here, but as I looked at it, it seemed abandoned. But if you were going to go sit somewhere, this would be a great bench because it looks out over a beautiful area. And right here, if there was some picture right there, you'd see a fish pen right here and a fish pen right here. So it looks out over 2 farms as well. So what were we talking about? Oh yeah, omega-3s. So this is one of the very crucial issues that happens with aquaculture, and we really have to find a way to get the omega-3s because otherwise we face the ceiling and we can't break through it. Well, as with proteins, people have been able to find ways to grow omega-3s in microbes and in plants. And so just this year, a company from the Bay Area, Corbion, was able to make omega-3 fatty acids by culturing phytoplankton in steel tanks. And they get the phytoplankton to grow that way. Another company will be out with a new process again with algae next year. And there are 2 other companies that have figured out how to make omega-3 fatty acids in plants. So for the first time ever, we see the possibility that the constraint in aquaculture diets and is being lifted by new technologies and practices that people are able to do. Carbohydrates are generally available. You can get them in a variety of different places. There's maize, there's wheat, there's all sorts and kinds of places that they can come from. So I mentioned I'd show you somebody feeding the fish. This is a pneumatic tube, and it shoots these pellets out into the farm, and the fish eat them. This farm had fairly large fish. They're 3.5 kilos. This is a real fish, this big. And these pellets were about 1.5 centimeters in diameter. And you see this boy here? He flew down and he got bonked in the head with one of these things. And he fell down calm, and then he flopped for a minute, and he sort of looked around, took his measure of the place. And he flew up and he said, yeah, well, I think I'll do it again. And he started trying to catch the pellets out of the air. So I come back to when I was 5 years old, or 6 years old, and my dad taught me what to do with a fish in a kitchen. That is something that has just profoundly affected me for my whole life. And this is my middle son who came over for dinner. My instructions were a shopping list. I was to have fish and beer and lots of both. And he took it from there, and he made some really beautiful bronzinos for us. He stuffed them 3 different ways. Back here is a chimichurri that he used for the 3rd one. And this is a picture from last Christmas. These 3 here are my kids, and this is the girlfriend of him. Remember I told you my daughter was kind of strict about stuff? Here she is saying, I grated this cheese, and if you touch it, you'll lose your hand. And my wife is saying, I said if you guys cooked, I'd clean, but I just don't think I mean it anymore. But for me, it's been cooking in my family, cooking with friends has been a fabulous thing throughout my whole life. So what I showed you was 2 days before Christmas. We do the Feast of 7 Fishes at our house. So nobody's Italian, but you got to go with Feast of 7 Fishes, right? And so these are California sardines that I cured for 6 days in blood orange juice and marjoram, and again, more pickled red onions. They are really good. And if any of you would like any of the recipes, if you'll write to me here and put recipes in the subject line, someday I will send you some recipes. Because if I've shown myself to be very scientific about something, I just don't do this in triplicate. I can do this in, some other iplicate. I'm really bad at getting recipes written down, but gradually I'm trying to do it, and if you want them, I'll send them to you. If 2 of you write to me, you'll get a very newsy note back, and I'll be happy to talk to you. If 20 of you write back, it'll be the recipe tags, and that's it. So I know that we have left time for questions, and I'd be more than happy to hear your questions and comments. Thank you all very much for coming out tonight as well.
All right, thank you, Scott. Now I'm really hungry, and we just ate. So we do have time for a few questions, and I just want to mention, because there are a lot of you here, first of all, we need you to use the mic because we are recording this, and also I'm sure a lot of you are going to have questions for Scott afterwards, but we're very fortunate. He mentioned 2 other experts. I'm going to put you guys on the spot. So we have Neil Sims and Holly Froelich in the back. They are both also aquaculture scientists, so if you students want to corner them after this, I'm sure they'd be happy to answer some questions. So who has a question?
I'm curious with the feed, is the nutritional characteristics of the fish any different?
No.
Not the proteins, but other side nutrition.
That was the first time I was ever concise in my life. So people have measured the nutritional quality, so measured both the macronutrients, so proteins, fats, carbohydrates that are there, and then also measured other micronutrients as well. And for all intents and purposes, within the limits of measurement, they're the same. Okay. So, for instance, you find greater variability in different species of salmon than you find in the variability for one species of salmon that either comes from the wild or comes from a farm.
Your lecture was very, very informative.
Thank you.
You speak about salmon, but are there other fish that will help reduce Alzheimer's, lung disease, and heart disease? And are there areas where farming fish, okay, salmon is more prevalent and will go well in this part of the world, and is it all throughout the world where it's going to work out real well? And what about all the pollution that's in the water from plastics and oils and stuff? Is that considered when a fish farm is decided where they're going to put it? Thank you.
Okay. Let me take the first of your 9 questions. And so the benefits were not peculiar to salmon, okay? I mention salmon a lot because I used to be a salmon farmer, and I probably know more about that than others. Neil will know more about Kampachi than anybody on the planet. So the benefits that I mentioned in that second study that had 420,000 people that were followed for 16 years, there was nothing that was species specific about that. In the first study that I mentioned, the one from the School of Public Health at the Harvard School of Public Health, what they said is the fish should be an oily fish. That doesn't just mean salmon, it means mackerel, herring, bluefish. I don't know if you get bluefish here. It's a lovely fish that we get in the East. Who else? Striped bass, sardines, anchovies. All of those fish would serve those needs. Next was the question about where salmon is grown. Salmon's grown in, I think, 7 or 8 countries, but some of them are fairly minor. Norway's the largest producer in the world. They produce about, rough numbers, 1.2 million tons. Next comes Chile at about 500,000 tons. Canada, 120 million tons. The EU, various in the parts of the UK, produce another 100-ish. Then the Faroe Islands, a little bit less than that. And then there's a little bit of salmon aquaculture, both in New Zealand and in Australia, but they really don't produce very much. The next was the issues of siting. So siting is one of the most important things that you can do when you put a farm in place, because what you want to do is you want to put it in the place where you have the best chance for the fish and for the environment to thrive. That said, to the extent that microplastics are appearing in the oceans, so it's not like this, when you think of plastic pollution in the ocean, what comes to mind is a very sensationalized something that's bigger than Texas or something that's bigger than I don't know what. Most of the volume is microparticles, and those are finding their way throughout the oceans. And it's hard to see how any place in the ocean is not going to be affected by that. Did I catch all your questions? Okay.
You mentioned is there a filter system, since you know there's microplastics that can be used around the fish farms so they're not going to be contaminated or affected?
There are systems called recirculating aquaculture systems, and a lot of times what you'll see written is RAS, R-A-S. And those are on-land systems, and the water does go through a filter. But when you think of what the advantage, this is a wee bit of hyperbole, but I think it captures my thought well. Growing fish on land makes good sense in the same way as growing chickens in submarines. Yeah, you bet. Yes, sir.
Are we not doing any kind of this kind of aquaculture here in the United States?
There is a bit of aquaculture that's happening in the United States. The United States is not an atmosphere politically that's really conducive to aquaculture. There's not a unified regulatory framework that makes it possible for a new business to say, I got to do this, 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 and this, and then I will have taken care of what I need to take care of. So NOAA is in the process of trying to aggregate people to develop that framework. And as well, there's a bill in the Senate whose intent is to begin to deal with some of those regulatory issues. That said, there's one salmon farm off the northeast coast. There are many, come on, Scott, say it, catfish farms in the United States. And then there's a lot of shellfish farming that goes on, particularly in Washington State, in Maine, and in the Gulf Coast. And actually, I didn't mention this because I was talking about how fish are fed, and there's a lot of aquaculture that's not fed. So for instance, oysters, scallops, clams, mussels are all things that they filter the plankton out of the environment, and the phytoplankton and zooplankton both, and that's what they use as their nutritional source. So from an environmental sustainability point of view, they're superlative, they're top of the heap.
And we also have Kampachi farms offshore, off of the coast of Hawaii. So these are the only offshore finfish farms, and we have a commercial producer, and we also have some research out there as well. So there is hope for the future in the U.S. And Maine is one of the most diverse in terms of the portfolio of the types of aquaculture. So they have shellfish, they have the finfish with the salmon, and they also have seaweed. And the interesting thing about that is they have fishermen who are working in the off-season to supplement their income. So lobster fishermen are actually growing seaweed in the off-season to supplement their incomes. Other questions?
Hello. Usually when I think of like the dangers of seafood, I think of like parasites or possibly mercury. Are those like relevant for farming fish, or are there any other dangers?
The parasites are a matter of good husbandry and good practice. And I wouldn't say my knowledge is encyclopedic, but I'm not aware of parasites that have been a problem with aquaculture. With respect to mercury, mercury accumulates in a fish as the fish encounters it during its lifetime. And so the fish that typically have the most mercury in them are the largest fish that are the oldest. So swordfish that are 35 years old, for instance. The fish that are raised in farms generally have a lifetime of perhaps a year and a half in the ocean. So the mercury that's in them is de minimis. If you look at the 8 lowest mercury-containing fish in the United States, according to the EPA, 7 of the 8 are farmed fish.
Okay, so you started off saying that you focus more on like tilapia because you caught it as a kid. Why did you decide to end up switching to salmon, or like focus like your work on salmon mostly?
In 2005, I would like to say that I was being methodical and thoughtful. I was just playing around. I was playing around looking at different things and trying to figure out, God, I really sound like a 4-year-old. What's cool? I just wanted to find cool stuff. And what was cool to me was this. What I wanted to do is I wanted to start a business that was built on a foundation of sustainability. So the profitability and the advancement of the business was dependent on it. I didn't want to do something where sustainability and environmental stewardship were in some kind of silo. You'd reach over there every once in a while, you'd grab a little bit of that goodness and you'd sprinkle it around and get on with the rest of your day. So when we found the way to replace fish oil in salmon diets, that's exactly what we had, okay? We had a way to solve a crucial environmental problem if we were going to continue to grow the industry. Now, I will tell you this. My interest is to see as much farm-raised fish, sustainably farm-raised fish, as we can possibly get. I think our public health, our well-being, all kind of things depend on that. And to have a nutritional future that's worth anything, we're going to have to farm fish. So I come sort of preloaded with all of those biases, okay? But what I found was a way to create a business that solved a problem, did it profitably by addressing an environmental issue. So that was my focus.
Yeah, and that's really important. That's something we look at here in the aquarium is sustainability is a three-legged stool. It's environmental, it's economic, and it's social. So if you don't have all of those pieces coming together, it's going to unravel. It's not sustainable if it's not economically sustainable. If the businesses can't operate, if they can't stay in business, then it's not really a sustainable enterprise. So this is something that we have to figure out, and some of these are wicked problems that we're looking at in terms of long-term sustainability and how we feed a growing population. So we have time for one more question. Any burning questions? Do Holly or Neil want to make any comments? Neil, do you want to talk about your experiences as a fish farmer?
I might just mention to the question of the US regulatory environment. You can tell from my accent, I'm not from here. People with funny accents love to come to this country because it really harbors innovation. This country's been a beacon for people that want to take innovative ideas and build businesses. And that's part of why I came to America. And part of what we're trying to change is our fish farm for Campachi that we're scaling up is down in Mexico. And we're scaling that up with US technology and with US investment. And guess where we want to sell the fish? Here. Long Beach, yeah. We're selling it in Mexico as well. We're going to sell it in Japan. We're going to sell it in Europe. The whole world needs more seafood. But part of the tragedy that we are working to try and resolve here at the regulatory level is that there is a drain of capital and initiative to other countries to develop the seafood that we really should be eating. And I would say that there's going to be more ranting about this if you don't tear the microphone from my hands. We really have a moral responsibility to be growing our own seafood rather than just expecting everybody else to grow it for us.
All right, Scott, do you have any final comments?
So for those of you who are students, when you think about what you want to do, having fun matters. Well, I mean, okay, it matters. And doing something important matters. And when you think about aquaculture, it kind of hits in every possible way. It's urgent, it's important, and it's a blast. And you really ought to just take a look and see, could I find myself being outdoors for 4 12-hour shifts and then being off for 4 days? Or would I rather be in a cubicle that has a white noise generator and coffee pods that produce really just awful coffee?
There's nothing like that fresh sea spray. All right, thank you very much, Scott. Thank you, everybody. So, as I mentioned, this is the last lecture of 2018, but we will be back in January, and I'm sorry, but I once again lost my sheet. I don't know where Linda is, but if you go to aquariumofpacific.org, you can find our lecture series, and we'll see you next year.
Please come out this way, the way you came in.
Is it okay?